Where does design inspiration come from? There's nature, like this honeycomb pattern I used in a tambour cabinet. Architecture, like these tiny chairs Mary Sy modeled after Philadelphia's iconic front doors. Cultural inspiration, like Paul Jasper's use of Japanese patterns in EDC trays. And what about the work of other makers that you may see while scrolling social media? But where is the line between inspiration and theft? Well, today we explore that topic as Paul Jasper and I dive into our latest collaboration, 3 floating wall cabinets inspired by another maker's work. You'll see how the design evolves into original pieces with reimagined shapes, new materials, and a few hidden surprises. And of course, we'll share the inevitable mistakes and questionable design choices along the way.
Oof.
But did our cabinets cross the line into design theft? This was the original image on Pinterest that inspired our cabinets, but there was no info linked to it. And the concept itself wasn't new. Pinterest is full of floating shelf cabinets with drawers. And I had built this bent lamination shelf last year with these cool pivot drawers, and Paul had designed this piece years ago, which was similar in concept, so we weren't breaking any new ground here. But later I discovered it was actually made by Matthias Mack in the UK. This meant Paul and I needed to reimagine it into something original, with a new shape, materials, and design aesthetic, because we definitely didn't want to copy another maker's work. But let's not forget what Austin Kleon wrote in his book Steal Like an Artist. Every new idea is just a mashup or a remix of one or more previous ideas. After multiple iterations on cardboard with a blue Sharpie, we were able to refine the shape of the piece into a gracefully tapered cabinet. We settled on roughly 30 inches long and 4 inches high, with a 15-degree taper on each end. And once we had our analog shape mapped out, we could digitize it and employ the use of a CNC to make one of my favorite parts of any build, a full-scale prototype. And this is proof that you don't need to make anything fancy for it to be a useful prototype. I mean, that drawer looks like it was made by Shopcat Jerry with his eyes closed. Now, functionally, using a brass rod as the hinge mechanism is a simple solution for a pivot drawer. However, getting that pivot point just right can be tricky. As you can see here, when the drawer opens, if you open it too far, it starts to dent the front. So that will definitely need some refinement, as does this hacky-looking chamfered edge here. Now, a few years ago, when Paul and I had built these Stadia whiskey cabinets, we discussed in length how we might construct these cases if we ever built them again. Now, we had done these with bent laminations in 2 halves and then glued the halves together. But making the bending forms and all that resawing and the glue-ups was very time-consuming. And one of the alternate options we had discussed was the technique of bricking, demonstrated here, which is gluing up multiple pieces on top of each other and then veneering the inside and out. Now, veneering the inside of something was always going to be a challenge. But for these cabinets, we didn't need to do that because the inside wouldn't be seen, which really swung the pendulum in the favor of this technique. So with the help of modern computer technology and Fusion 360, we laid out a bunch of these corner pieces and cut them on the CNC out of 3/4-inch Baltic birch plywood. Now, we also drilled registration holes, which would allow these pieces to align perfectly when we glued them up. Otherwise, pieces this small, when you put wet glue, they want to slide all over the place like you're trying to pick up an eel. It was also at this point that we decided to cut enough pieces to brick up 2 cabinets. I mean, since the CNC could make such quick work of it, we could then spend our time exploring even more design possibilities with an additional cabinet. And while the machine was cutting the top and bottom pieces, we even threw out the idea of building one of these cabinets out of solid wood, which would eliminate all of this bricking and the veneer work that was unknowingly going to be a royal pain in my tuchus. All right, as you can see, I'm back in my shop. The time at Paul's was very limited due to travel schedules, but we were still able to get a lot done. Now, since we got all the corners bricked and glued up, What we need to do now is get the top and bottom veneered for both sets of cabinets that we made. Now, ideally, what should have happened is we should have veneered the plywood first and then cut everything on the CNC. I'm going to do that now. Now, unfortunately, we're going to need to do this in 2 stages. Because of the holes that we made here for our registration pins and our bricked corners, I can't just veneer both sides at the same time because then I wouldn't be able to see the hole. So what I'm going to need to do is veneer the inside first, then drill those holes through, and then I can veneer over the whole top. Now, at this point, you might be wondering what these cutouts are for. Well, Paul and I thought it would be pretty cool to inlay a 3D printed planter, which of course was printed on my amazing Bamboo Lab H2D 3D printer. The great thing about the H2D having 2 nozzles is being able to use a different filament for the supports that is mounted right on the side of the machine. And using specific support material from bamboo makes them super easy to peel off without damaging your print. Now, the original idea for this planter was to add some lovely greenery as well as another focal point for the piece. Well, that was the plan anyway, but more on that later. And once the insides were veneered, I could flush trim them and resaw some unbelievably beautiful figured English walnut for the outside show faces. Now, it just so happens that the grain on this piece that I resawed flares out at an angle. So, if I do a book match like this, and I align my piece here, the grain is running parallel to the back edge, and hopefully you can see on camera, the grain is running parallel with the front edge. So if I just trace this real quick, you should be able to see there that the grain is running parallel with the back, and then when it flips, it is now running parallel with that front edge. And as discussed before, once the inner faces were veneered, I needed to drill those registration holes back through so that we could register the dowels from our glued up corner bricks. Now, these veneers are a little under 1/8 of an inch thick, which is plenty robust enough to just use some green painter's tape to pull that seam nice and tight for the glue up. But first, I needed to trim away the excess veneer and put it aside to be used later. Now, when I veneer the top on here, the pressure from the vacuum is going to want to suck it into this cavity. So I need to cut a dummy piece to fill this, which I'll wrap in clear packing tape so it doesn't stick. And the real kicker here is none of this would have been necessary if we had veneered the plywood first and then cut and drilled these parts on the CNC. But you know, I don't make anything easy because, well, that would be too easy. And if you do any kind of veneer work or large panel glue ups, these glue pots with the foam roller are like pushing the easy button for glue spreading. I did put a link down in the description if you're interested in making your life better by 0.0001%. And back in the vac bag we go, which is going to be a running theme in this video. Fortunately, Jerry was there to supervise or hinder my progress, whichever way you want to spin it. All right, big guy, gotta move. Come on. I'm sorry. Come on. This is my life, folks, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Although, sharp claws near a plastic bag. I gotta play with that. Some quick flush trimming at the router tableau on the first pair of tops and bottoms. And then it was just rinse and repeat for the other set. And as you'll notice, I used the cutoffs from the other top to piece together the bottom of this one. When dealing with highly figured rare veneer, none of this animal goes to waste. Boy, talk about deja vu. But this time, it's Shopcat Lola as the vac bag Gestapo. And now, we can finally take a break from the vac bag ballyhoo and move on to more important things. Now, I don't know about you, but sometimes I just don't realize that I've missed an important detail until it's staring me right in the face. Kind of like Drew Witt creepily ogling his track saw collection over his morning coffee. Now, when the pivot drawer opens on these floating cabinets, the inside vertical edges will be seen. So I didn't want layers of glued up plywood to catch your eye. Nor did I want that visible on the back corners of the cabinets. even though those would be up against the wall. I mean, I really wanted to hide all evidence of plywood, primarily so I could avoid the "that's not real furniture, it's crappy plywood" naysayers. Yes, they are out there and growing by the day. Okay, so I've hit a bit of a design snag here. The veneer that I used on the top of both of these cabinets were sequential pieces that I'd resawn from the same piece of wood. So, in essence, they're exactly the same. Can you say carbon copy? Now, the idea of creating two separate cabinets was so that we could experiment a little bit with design on each one to make them look different from one another, not to make them look like identical twins. So I don't really have any walnut, really crazy figured walnut here in my shop. So what I've done is I've gone online and I've ordered two different lots, which should be I think that's FedEx right there. I'll be right back. All right, here we go. Jerry, new box for you, buddy. Ooh. Whoa. Wow. Look at the figure on that. So this is the curly smoked red oak, which gives it that brown appearance, almost like walnut. And just to give you an idea on price, this piece of curly smoked red oak is 16 inches wide and 99 inches long. Luckily, it was in their bargain bin because they only had one lot left and it was 45 bucks. And one day, I'll invest in a veneer saw, but for now, my handy utility knife does the job. But man, this super curly figure is super brittle. So I'm gonna have to be ultra careful in cutting and handling this stuff. And the reason I throw a little shrink wrap on these pieces before I slide them into their vac bag swaddle is it prevents any of that glue squeeze out from coating the inside of the bag. Okay, now I need to figure out the shape of the drawer. So what I've done here is cut a piece of scrap plywood, drilled a 1/4 inch hole, put the brass rod in, and also given myself 1/16 of an inch gap on each side. So as you can see, when I turn this, it makes contact right here. So this needs to have some kind of a curved shape like that in order to make that turn without rubbing against the side. Now, I just so happen to have this piece of bent lamination that I did on another project, and from the looks of it, when I put it in here, this may actually be pretty close to the shape we want. So I'm just going to trace this on here and cut it out and see how it looks. And if this actually fits, then I can use an existing bending form and I don't need to make another one. Now, the other thing I need to pay attention to is I want a bit of straight here before it starts to curve, because I think we're going to hand cut some dovetails in this drawer box. And to do that, I really want a straight edge and not have to cut them in a curved surface. All right, let's see what we got here. All right, so we clear everything over here, no problem. But I'm hitting over here a little bit less than 1/8 of an inch in. So let's back bevel this and see how it looks. A few swipes with the hand plane should get us where we need to be. Now we have clearance. Nice. So now that the mechanics of the curved drawer is figured out, it's time to resaw some walnut for the bent lamination. Now, it's always nice to be able to make your own shop sawn veneers, but don't let anyone fool you. It's a bit of a laborious process, dominated mostly by standing next to the drum sander with nothing but the low hum of a dust collector and my inner monologue telling me to listen to music or a podcast, and not raw dogging it like some decadent Philistine. And now to test the bend. Oh yeah, that'll work. All right, so I just want to show you what's happening here. Even though I have cork, my laminations, 3/8 bendy ply, 1/8 bendy ply, and clamping cauls, what happens when I apply pressure is you can see that it starts to belly in. And that's going to leave an impression on my lamination, which I don't want. So what's the solution, Lola? A mating bending form? Great idea. First, I'll clamp a piece of 1/4 inch MDF to my bending form. Now the thickness of my laminations are 3/8 of an inch. So I'm going to take this little scribe block, set it to the 3/8 of an inch spot, and just scribe a line all the way around. Now I'll cut close to that line as I can, then clean it up on the spindle sander, and this will be my template to make the rest of the bending form. I like to use the table saw whenever I can to get nice straight cuts like this. But for the rest of the cut, I can rough it out with the jigsaw, or you can use a bandsaw, and then clean everything up at the spindle sander. Now this 1/4 inch piece of MDF is just a template that I can screw to 3/4 inch MDF to then start shaping the form. And like most multi-layer bending forms, it all gets flush trimmed at the router table so every piece matches perfectly. And a little CA glue locks this layer into place while I drive home some screws. Now I ended up using 4 layers of MDF and left the 1/4 inch template attached on top for a little extra thickness to match the old bending form that I would be clamping to. Okay, just threw this in the clamps real quick. Everything looks nice and tight. No undulations, bumps, or anything. So a little extra time, but this was definitely the way to go. Isn't that right, Jerry? A little paste wax ensures any glue squeeze out won't stick to my shiny new form. Total boat, baby! And for the extended open time that it affords, I'll be using Total Boat epoxy to glue up these laminations. And I always choose a hard-setting glue like epoxy or polyurethane glue or Unibond 800 for bent laminations. PVA glue is actually quite soft and can cause creep, and your laminations could move on you. Now you might also notice that I cut the new bending form that I made into 2 pieces. This makes it much easier to clamp up in stages and push that excess epoxy out towards the end. Boy, that AI stuff is really starting to freak me out. I mean, shut the shop door. All right, what do we got? Ooh, that looks good. Now for the white oak version for the other cabinet. And second verse, same as the first. All right, let's speed this up a little bit. We got people waiting. And 24 hours later, the fruits of our labor emerge. Looks like we're 2 for 2. Now, a lot of times with these bent laminations, the layers slip a little and you get a shingling effect. And the easiest way I've found to clean that up, along with the glue squeeze out, is to carefully run it over the jointer. This will give you a nice square reference surface that you can then take to the table saw to rip it to final width. Now you can certainly do this with a hand plane as well. Now this technique does take a little bit of practice since you are pushing forward against the fence as well as spinning the piece all at the same time. So be careful out there. Now it's time to put our curved drawer box onto our dummy drawer bottom here. Now originally the plan was for the drawer shape to follow the case. However, that creates a weird joint here, and I'd really just want to square this off. So I'm going to get this lined up, and I want to maintain a distance from the drawer back to the cabinet back of at least a 1/2 inch, because I have a 1/4 inch French cleat and a 1/4 inch back going on here. So I don't want there to be any interference. I'm going to put a square on here to make sure we're at 90 there. I'm going to slide this over a little bit. So I have roughly a 1/16 inch gap. So with my spacer here, I'm good. That's at 90 degrees. So now I can mark right here where I need to make that cut. I'm going to wait to mark and cut this side until the joinery is done here, just in case I screw something up with these dovetails and I need to adjust the position of this. Now, I am not going to pretend that I am an expert at cutting dovetails, and to be quite honest, I really only have one shot at this, because if I screw them up and have to cut this back, it could be an issue because then I don't have a flat spot to work off of. And I am actually a tails first kind of guy. I'm going to lay out my location. Now, I've done this on a test piece already, so I know the spacing is how I want it. So now once I go one way, going back the other way, putting the impressions in from the dividers. So now I have impressions here that I can use to lay out my tails. I'm going to use an X-Acto knife on the tape. Now, the other thing I like to do because of body mechanics is angle my piece so that I'm actually making these saw cuts vertical or perpendicular to the ground, so that when you put a square on this, it's pretty much vertical. And this Dozuki Rip Saw by Temple Tools is a Cadillac. I mean, the thinnest kerf, really easy to get this started. And I'm not sure I mentioned this, but I haven't hand cut a dovetail in about 4 years, so I was going pretty slow and steady with this process. And then with everything roughed out as close to my layout lines as I was brave enough to go, I could take it the rest of the way with some chisels. And man, that end grain of white oak is always a bear to pare through. And then it was on to cutting those pesky pins. And again, this Temple Tools Dozuki Rip Saw, well, ripped right through that white oak. All right, moment of truth. That is not great. You can definitely see that gap right there. But I can put a wedge in there to fill that. Everything else looks reasonable. Not great, but reasonable. What do you think there, Lola Pop? In retrospect, I wasn't really happy with my tail and pin layout. I should have just made 2 big tails instead of 3. Oh well, there's no changing it now. All right, so in my never-ending quest to avoid using hand tools and to solve problems using power tools, I needed a way to cut this rabbet in the drawer front, but unfortunately there's no flat reference surface, and the rabbet basically starts on the curve. So what I've done is I've clamped it to the bending form and then made this little jig with cleats on the front and back that fit over this. Now I can clamp that in place. I've also put a sacrificial piece in the back so I don't get any blowout. And now with the pattern bit, I can just come along here, make one pass, adjust the depth of my router bit, and make the final pass. And I'll have a perfectly crisp square groove. As demonstrated here, it actually worked. And just like the white oak version, I could trim the ends of the walnut version. I also had the right side of the drawer that I needed to rip to the same width. Whoa, did you see that? Slow that down, let's watch it again. Now I don't know about you, but when this little Festool table saw swallows up my offcuts and clogs my hose, I get a little peeved. Fortunately, my buddy Eric Spenceley sent me the file that he designed for a zero clearance insert that I proceeded to print several of on my Bamboo 3D printer. And while Eric only sells the physical product for these ZCIs for this little saw, he graciously sent me the file to 3D print because I may, or may not, have some incriminating photos of him from his wedding night. And now for the test cut. Would you look at that? But let's not stop there. This ZCI party is just getting warmed up. He also sent me the file for the Festool Capex. Again, he only sells physical product for this, but I was able to get the printable file because, well, you remember. And there are links down in the description to Eric's store if you want to pick some of these up for yourself. Thanks, Eric. And like most drawers, these need bottoms. So I'm cutting a 1/4-inch groove in all of my pieces to house said bottoms. A featherboard helps keep the material tight against the fence and ensure a consistent depth on all pieces. And to eliminate the pucker factor with the curved pieces and prevent any tippage, I use some tape and CA glue to stick on a little handle. Simple, but very effective. So after about an hour of messing around with various bearings and setups, trying to get the depth I wanted, I couldn't come up with anything, so I just wrapped green tape around there to get the correct diameter that I needed. Unfortunately, it didn't even occur to me until after I did all this that I could 3D print my own specialty bearing, which I modeled up real quick. So if I take an existing smaller bearing, snap that in there, then by removing this and then dropping that on there, bolting that down, and that would have given me the correct groove depth that I was after. I really wish I would have thought of that first. Drawer bottoms are a great place to add a splash of visual interest. So Paul was kind enough to send along some of his checkerboard veneer that he makes to adorn the drawer bottom of this walnut version of our cabinets. And I love design elements that are hidden most of the time, but then hit you right in the face when they reveal themselves. It's a nice little sensory surprise when you least expect it. That's exactly right, Jerry. And if you think that looks good now, wait until the finish goes on and it really pops. Now, to get this panel roughly to size, I'm just using the chop saw to remove the majority of the waste and fine-tuning it on the spindle sander. And then it was time for the dry fit. I don't know about you, but I am really digging it. And to pre-finish the drawer bottom, as well as the inside faces of the drawer sides, I'm using an LED-cured oil wax finish that you have seen me use many times in previous videos. This is a 2-to-1 mix of ultramatte to semi-gloss of Heidelberg Pro Lignum. Now, I put 3 coats on in short order, and then I could get this curvaceous little beauty glued up. And as you can see, I'm using part of the bending form to hold the curved part of the drawer in place while I got my clamps all situated. And while Jerry stood watch, I could move on to the white oak version. If you recall, a brass rod will be used as the pivot hinge for these drawers. But the one caveat to this is that the rod needs to be perfectly 90 degrees to the top and bottom panel to function correctly. Let's just hope my drill press isn't out of whack. And I don't know about you, but it's always an exciting moment for me when I'm able to move on to the next phase of construction and things start to take shape as you had envisioned. And thanks to those pre-drilled registration holes and dowels, the process was so much easier. And while that was in the clamps, I could move on to more adornments, which are some brass pins for the rabbeted corners of this drawer. A simple little jig ensures all holes are evenly spaced, and a little total boat forming an epoxy is all you need to secure them. Now, I did trim these brass pins with a flush trim saw before busting out the file, but forgot to hit record on the camera. It's not the first time, and certainly won't be the last. And with all that practice under my belt from the first one, I could repeat the whole process all over again for the oak version. And again, I'm only gluing the bricked corners to the bottom layer at this point, because the next phase will be setting the drawers in place and encapsulating them when I glue the tops on.
All right, buddy, we did it.
Here's a moment I had actually been dreading. Drilling holes to remove the placeholders for the planters that had been trapped when I veneered the top. I didn't take any measurements, so I kind of winged it. Fortunately, the planter has a nice lip on it that will cover that Forstner bit snafu that I made. Okay, I have an issue here that has been driving me crazy for hours because I could not figure out why this was happening. So when I open this drawer, the further I open it, the tighter it was getting, and it was really rubbing. The walnut version I did had no problem, so I couldn't figure out why. I thought maybe the drawer was twisted, but I tested that. It was dead flat. And then as I looked closer, I realized as this was opening, it was actually riding up over here on the hinge pin side. Let me show you. Now you'll notice the gap right here between the bottom of the walnut and the top of the white oak drawer. And as I open it, it starts to slide upwards, which means that that brass dowel is at an angle. So how I'm going to fix that is, rather than using one pin that goes all the way through, is I'm going to use a shorter pin on the top and a shorter pin on the bottom. And I tested this and it does work. Now the only problem is, because this hole goes all the way through, this pin on top, if it ever becomes just slightly loose, it could start to fall down in there. So what I'm going to do is roughly a 1/2 inch down to a 1/2 inch up is I'm going to glue in a dowel. So that way the pin cannot fall down. Now I don't need a lot of glue in here. I just want something to hold it in place. So I'm just going to use a little toothpick, go down in there as far as I can without touching the sides. It's a little game of operation here. And then I put a pin in the back here to prevent me from going in too far. I had mentioned earlier that Paul and I had discussed doing a solid wood version of this build, so we could completely eliminate the bricking and all the ensuing veneer work that was yet to come. Well, unbeknownst to me, the cheeky little bugger that he is was working on this version secretly back at his shop. And unbeknownst to him, he had actually reversed the shape of the cabinet, making it even more original. And now for a little housekeeping, because a little detail I neglected to consider was veneering the back edges of the top and bottom to cover up the plywood edges. I also needed to rip down some strips for the backs of the cabinets out of 1/4-inch material. So many details.
Okay, what I'm trying to figure out now is where to cut the finger notch so that you can reach from underneath the cabinet and pull the drawer open. So I cut a couple of different size notches on the laser, and if I place this under here, I can kind of get an idea of where this needs to reside. So this one is 3/4 of an inch wide and about 2 inches long. And I guess depending on how fat your finger is, that might be a little better. So if we go with the larger size, you want enough room behind it to get your finger up and grab the drawer, but then also the slot to be long enough for you to pull it open enough to grab it. Now I'm gonna use the same file that I created to cut this template and use that on the shaper origin to cut out this whole pocket. And then we'll have to create a smaller pocket on the underside for a little brass insert.
But before I could cut that, it was time for a Shaper Origin upgrade, a new gridding spindle. I printed this on the Bamboo H2D using PAHT carbon fiber filament, which needs higher temperatures and a controlled heated chamber, which is exactly what the H2D's updated 350-degree nozzle and active heating chamber are built for, printing stronger, more heat-resistant parts. And if you've ever created a grid with the Shaper Origin, you know it's kind of a hassle to swap out bits to create your grid points. This means the spindles can easily be swapped in and out without changing bits. Now, cutting the pocket on the underside of these cabinets was the easy part. The difficult part was going to be cutting the brass. I have cut brass in the past with the Shaper Origin, but with minimal success, due in part to I think I was using the wrong bit and my spindle speed was cranked up too high. So this time I corrected those inadequacies and had much better luck. Now this is a detail you'll rarely ever see unless you look underneath, but sometimes those are my favorite details. And to cover up that raw plywood edge around the inside, I used a little India ink and then some CA glue to secure the brass. Boy, I do love me some brass and walnut. And now, before we do the final glue up of the top and the drawer in place, let's do a dry fit of this planter and make sure everything fits.
I don't know. It doesn't go with the piece. Plastic is a little cold, and even with some greenery growing over, I don't know if this was the right choice.
All right, we'll have to come back to that later because it's going to be a complete redesign that's going to require quite a bit of thought. In the meantime, I needed to get some blocks glued in, which will allow me to screw on the backs and the French cleat for hanging. And before gluing these cases together, I wanted to apply finish to the drawers and check the final fit and function so I could then install the drawer stops. And now for those drawer stops.
All right, so I've clamped a straight edge across the front here to make sure the drawer is in perfect alignment with my case. And now I need to glue in a little drawer stop in the back. Now, I probably should have done this before I glued this big one on, but oh well. Now, I do want to make sure it's perfectly in line with the other block because that was registered to the back panel. So just a little CA glue. Now I can remove these and double check the stop.
That's actually pretty good. And a little oil on the bottom of this cabinet brings us one step closer to the finish line. You know, sometimes wood is a funny thing because the UV cured finish on this English walnut didn't really do a lot to the figure. But Paul always uses walnut oil first, which makes that grain pop like crazy before putting the final coat of oil on. And conversely, the curly smoked red oak literally went pewing with LED hard wax oil. I mean, look at that figure. That is Mother Nature at her finest.
All right, so what I've done is I have waxed using this Renaissance wax the bottom surface here and the underside of the drawer. And this should really decrease the surface tension or surface friction here and allow this drawer to flow freely and smoothly. I've also waxed the brass pin that is going to go right in here. Now to get that in place, I'm just going to test the action here before I glue this up. That is really smooth.
Now I could finally get the top glued into place and then move on to veneering the entire front. And while that was drying, I cut some scrap plywood that would act as support for my veneer while in the vac press. I also covered the edges with tuck tape to avoid any squeeze-out issues. Now these outer pieces of plywood bread allow me to overhang the veneer a little bit on both sides and trim the excess later. If I didn't do this, it would have just cracked off in the vac press, resulting in a late-night meltdown, and nobody wants to see that. Then it was in the bag to let it cook for roughly 60 to 73 minutes. I'm not gonna lie, I was pretty nervous that I wasn't going to get perfect adhesion across the entire surface. But once I peeled off all the tape and cracked open the plywood shell, everything seemed to work all right. But still have one more cabinet to go. And then it was some very careful flush trimming with a compression bit from Bits and Bits, which, man, produced a perfectly smooth surface with no splintering or tear out. Phew! And now for the super delicate operation of cutting out the drawer front.
Oh!
Oof. I was not expecting that. And at the time, I didn't know why that had happened, like it had just busted open like it was under pressure, like an overcooked hot dog in a pot of boiling water. But after some fine detective work, I did figure out what had happened. And I'll give you a more detailed explanation once I get this top glued on and get into the veneer work. And after much thinking and back and forth with Paul, we finally solved the plantar fasciitis conundrum. A little valet tray insert that would be the perfect mix of form and function. And fortunately, I was able to take the digital file from the planter and turn it into a file that I could use the shaper origin to cut a solid wood insert frame with a little rim around the top. So I cut one out of white oak, did a little test fit, and then I could cut its twin from the English walnut. But we still needed to decide what to line the bottom with, since this was going to be a prominent feature on the top of the cabinet. And we're going to need a little time to think about that. And here is why the other cabinet burst open. The vac bag applies pressure horizontally as well as vertically, so it actually closed up the 1 millimeter gap between the drawer and the case. So this time, I put some spacers in there to prevent that. Thanks for the tip, Jerry. Unfortunately, I was met with another problem. Now, since the curly oak was so brittle, I had to first veneer a sublayer down for it to adhere to. Well, I guess the glue started setting before it got in the bag, resulting in this. Fortunately, I was able to save the day by squirting a little CA glue in there, and everything held fine. But to avoid any curing issues from happening with the real veneer, I'm using Total Boat epoxy here that I actually tinted black because I knew I would probably get some bleed through, and the thought was it might blend a little better if I did. But more importantly, it would give me a dark glue line all the way around rather than seeing clear epoxy. And because this was epoxy, I needed to let this one set overnight. Okay, let's try this drawer cutting operation again. Fortunately, Jerry was there to lend a helping hand of distraction. And thankfully, this one didn't go boom, but it did take a while to get it to fully break free, and I won't bore you with that. Now we can turn our attention back to the valet tray bottoms. I thought some walnut burl might add some visual but subtle interest, so I veneered some MDF, then gave it a little glue, placed my pre-finished frame on top, gave it some downward pressure and some time to dry, and then a little flush trim before applying a little bit of finish. And for the walnut version, Paul came through again with some of his plaid veneer, which paired beautifully with the checkerboard drawer bottom that we had chosen. And after a flush trimming dust storm, could apply a little bit of finish and give it a test fit. Yeah, me likey. And now for a sneak peek of the walnut burl version.
Oof. I'm not sure that's the right choice. Paul?
And with the help of Google Gemini, Paul was able to quickly whip up a bunch of variations that we could easily eliminate from consideration, and others we would hem and haw over, but in the end, we both agreed on one clear winner.
Well, it definitely looks better than the burl. It pops, nice contrast. I think this is what we're gonna go with. What do you guys think?
And way back when I had glued up the drawer, I thought the smoked oak veneer would be sufficient for the drawer bottom. But after deciding on the stripes for the valet tray, we had to carry that detail inside the cabinet as well. And then it was time to cut away any trace of that walnut burl and make a new tray bottom and get that installed. This is a great example of the evolution of design. What begins as an idea often changes course dramatically once it becomes reality. And you realize that idea wasn't so good.
There we go. All right, so I did find a way to make this planter work and keep it relatively hidden and tasteful. Let me show you. Now this is just an extra cat. As I was saying, this is just an extra tray insert that I had cut. It was the wrong size. But what I've done is I have taken a spare planter and cut off the rim. So you remember before it had this little rim all the way around to sit on top. So I've cut that off. And what I could do is I could cut a 1/8 of an inch groove in the bottom of this all the way around and then insert it into there, which would still allow the individual custom pots to be inserted in there, but it would all be below the surface and the rim of this tray would hide it all.
I'm not sure this detail was completely necessary, but I wanted to install some set screws through the back of each cabinet to secure the valet trays in place. Then I could install the cabinet backs and 3D print the large French cleats on the Bamboo H2D printer because of its large capacity build plate. I would have had to piece these together if I had used a smaller printer. And once I printed the male and female portion of the French cleats, I could get those affixed to the back of each cabinet and finally get these bad boys hung up on the wall. First was the English walnut version, test the drawer out, and then we could pop on the curly smoked red oak version, test the drawer, and now for some glamour shots. And let's start with what Paul cooked up back at his shop with the solid wood version. And not only did he do 2 pull-out dovetail drawers with custom brass pulls, he fired up his lathe and turned these unbelievable crinkle maple bowls with brass-lined finger pulls. And while I'm super happy with our decision to go with the striped inlays on the curly smoked red oak version with the white oak drawer, I'm definitely partial to the English walnut version with the plaid insert tray and checkerboard drawer bottoms. So, of all 3 versions, which is your favorite? Austin Kleon said that imitation is not flattering. What's flattering is transformation. So, do you think we transformed the original piece that inspired us into something unique and unmistakably ours? I certainly do. Thanks so much for watching. See you on the next one.